So good morning, everyone. For this week's Coffee Morning, we're joined by Deirdre O'Mahony, who's our new artist in residence for 2021-2022. I can see Mark Clare is in the audience, so following in strong footsteps. And these artists in residence program was initiated and run by UCD Parity Studios by Emer Boyle and colleagues, and we think it's a fantastic initiative, and we're working with Deirdre on this residency with Dunleary Rathdown County Council as well. I do recommend following the link in the weekly email to Deirdre's webpage, which presents a philosophy which is very closely aligned with the one which underpins what we're trying to do in the Earth Institute, and there's really a fascinating array of projects that have been completed over the past 2 decades there. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from Deirdre about some of her work now. And I'll hand you straight over.
Thanks, Tasman. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present here this morning. I'm going to talk about a project, mainly about a project that I'm working on and focused on, called Sustainment Experiments. And, whoops, sorry, for some reason, okay, that's fine, yeah. So Sustainment Experiments is really a way about thinking about a kind of thinking about and giving form to a notion of a collective political ecology that can think about interspecies dependency and what actions we can take in the face of climate and biodiversity crisis. And the idea, the notion of sustainment is one I find really attractive. It was put forward by Tony Fry as a way of capturing an equivalent moment to the Enlightenment in the capacity to transform, completely transform, and radically shift cultural actions and behaviors. So if you think about what the Enlightenment did in the 16th, 17th, 18th century and the changes that brought about, what can we do right now that will shift thinking away from a kind of human-centric perspective towards an idea of interspecies codependency, I guess. So the project is called Sustainment Experiments, and it's a way of thinking about farming and farming knowledge, and in particular, small-scale farming and the role that might play in thinking about soil, in particular, I suppose, food security, but also soil remediation and soil ecologies. It's thinking about the notion, and Taz has just pulled me rightly about focusing mainly on a scientific collaborations. And of course, I'm not just interested in scientific collaborations. I'm interested in talking to those in the social sciences, in humanities. I mean, my best work comes out of transdisciplinary collaborations, whether they're with farmers, whether they're with academics. So it's not confined to any one discipline, because I think, and it's why I'm so delighted to be situated in the Earth Institute, what I think is really important is what researchers from all perspectives can bring to imagining the actions that need to be taken right now. And I've in the coffee morning sessions I've been sitting in on, I hear this kind of plea for interdisciplinarity, and I think artists, many artists like myself are used to working in a space where we actually don't really know what's going to happen, where we have to be open to the possibilities that are presented, whether by situations or by dialogue and discourse or by social engagement. And it's in a sense in that space of not knowing what's going to happen that I think the real innovation and the real imaginative capacity for interdisciplinarity emerges. So Sustainment Experiments is going to play out through different events. I use plantings a lot. Plantings sometimes in collaboration with the Loy Association of Ireland, whose skills in making really straight, perfectly straight potato ridges. We have collaborated on different projects using those skills over the years. And in particular, this year, I've been thinking about how we might work together for Sustainment Experiments. And I've been doing a series of projects called plots. And the plot one was initially done at Visual Art Centre in Carlow. And it began with a planting of potatoes, literally to break the ground outside Visual. And I'm really interested in the notion of the potato ridge as a kind of technology that was born from the absolute desperation for a need for food security in the past, and kind of redeploying that or reusing it to point to the somewhat precarious situation that I think we're in at present in relation to food production and consumption. So I was trying to think of what form I could give to a planting outside Carlow. I wanted initially, the idea was to plant sainfoin, which is a crop that was used as an animal fodder in the UK mainly up until the 50s, until the industrialization of agriculture came along. But sainfoin really intrigued me, and I did a lot of research on it in a previous project. And it intrigued me because of its capacity to both fix nitrogen, but also it has real benefits for animals' health. It improves the uptake of protein. It has anthelmintic properties, so it reduces parasitic infections. And what first drew me to it was the fact that it reduces methane output in animals. So, sorry, my slides are going mad here. So, but in order to break the ground for the sainfoin, I decided to use potato ridges, and the potato ridges lent themselves really well to replaying, to making a kind of image that I thought best represented the question of what the future of sustainable food might be. I cast the I Ching, and the ridges were used to represent hexagram number 15, which was the response. And you'll see yourself there. It's a really interesting response that gets thrown up by the I Ching in relation to that question. Those potatoes have now been harvested, and that plot has been replanted with sainfoin. At the same time, I was asked to do a planting actually of potatoes in Korea, but potatoes won't grow in the autumn in Korea. So I proposed buckwheat instead, and that's just been grown and harvested. And now that site is being used as a village for vegetable growing in the nearby village. So the plantings are kind of one stage of this project. Another stage is a series of 3 dinners, that feast events that recreate another key figure in relation to the Enlightenment and food production in France, a scientist called A. Parmentier. And Parmentier changed cultural attitudes to the potato in France in the 18th century and helped alleviate cyclical famines there. And he did that through a series of really creative actions. He was kind of like, I like to think of him as the Andy Warhol of his time. And one of his events was to hold a potato feast where every course was made from potatoes. And I loved that notion of the feast and he brought to that feast all the key players in Paris who were affecting food policy in France at the time. So I'm kind of taking that idea and bringing it to an event in Dublin, which will be done under the umbrella of the Irish Museum of Modern Art's Anthropocene exhibition at the Irish Cultural Centre in France, where we will do a potato dinner that thinks about the role of food security in the city. And I'm also artist in residence next year in Kilkenny, and I'm the soil artist residency. So I'll be doing a series, I'll be doing a feast there. I will also be doing soil workshops there. And this is something I'm really interested in opening up to soil scientists in UCD. I have a room that I'll be taking over in the RHA gallery next February, which is kind of open research room that the curator described as a kind of map of all my current obsessions, which is which would be really all the books and texts that I've been reading over the past few years that I consider essential, but framed in a very particular and I hope relevant way to complement an exhibition on women and farming. I'm also going to be working on a project called Field Exchange, which is the Creative Ireland Climate Call Commission project, and another large-scale planting there I'll talk about later. Yeah, and the outcome of all this research will be a poetic documentary film for exhibition in 23-24. So Field Exchange, this is the project that I'm doing for Creative Ireland. And again, you know, drawing on the skills of the Loy Association, who've been really great collaborators. We will be making a 50-metre by 50-metre planting orientated towards the set in a diamond in a really large field that overlooks the Loch Derg. And in a way, it's an aesthetic kind of catalyst for a series of 12 field exchanges that'll be taking place between NOTS, the National Organic Trust, and farmers and artists and food producers over 12 weeks in the summer. And at the same time, there'll be the farm will be opened up and the planting will be opened up on a weekly basis to the public. So it's really, again, all about activating a conversation about the role of climate change and farming. Yeah. So I'm currently making a dinner service, and you can see an image here of porcelain cast potato cups. And I'm looking for imagery to use on the different plates that I've been making, which are also made from things like cast root systems. And one idea I have for this that I've already been talking to some people about is the idea of what their ideal plant might be to deal with the climate crisis. So, for example, one farmer has talked about using emmer wheat on a root system of plants like sainfoin and lucerne as a way of addressing both the need for nitrates and soil fertility at the same time as preserving heritage wheat varieties. So I have a template for that, and if anybody's interested, please email me and I'll send you the template to describe your ideal crop. So here's really, these are the things I'm open to finding out about. I'm already in contact with scientists from the Department of Agriculture for advice on diverse forages and growing them. I'm really keen to get more information on dung beetles, earthworms, roots and mycelium systems for use on the dinner service. I'm also really interested in whether anybody is doing research and recording the sounds of undersoil activities. I know that Melvin Shedlick has actually recorded the sounds of mycelial fungi underground, but I'm really interested in capturing some of these, and also your ideal plant and crop submissions. So I hope this hasn't, well, if any of you are interested in learning anything further, you can ask me questions now or email me at the email address below. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, Deirdre. It was interesting your focus on soil. When I first started this role, I went to a UCD soil symposium, which really conveyed very strongly the importance and fragility of soil, but also the fact that we actually know a lot about it, and there are clear recommendations for what needs to be done to manage and conserve it. But the real limiting step is uptake. You know, that the farmers, farm advisors, the policymakers, they're putting the brakes on. They're not carrying forward those recommendations. And so, to me, you know, this kind of activity is so important in kind of helping us over those kinds of limiting steps and getting people to better understand the situation and what needs to be done. So I think it's fantastic to see what you're doing there. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to make?
Could I ask something? Just sorry, Dara, you go ahead, Dara.
Right, yeah, sorry. I think Dara just beat you on the unmute.
Sorry, Orla. No, not at all. Deirdre, I don't have much to say, only that you're, it's really interesting stuff, and you're totally in the right place. We have so many colleagues, as Taz has said, here in UCD who are into soil biodiversity, the structure of roots under soil. I'm sure you're aware of some of them, but if not, I can certainly put you in touch, because there's a lot of research going on in this space. So best of luck with everything. It really sounds fascinating.
Thank you, Dara.
Go ahead, Orla.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Deirdre. That was so interesting. I can't wait to see the dinner service that comes out of it. It seems really creative and amazing. So it's that's great. So I'm a social scientist, so I'm no use to you in terms of soil. So I'm sorry about that. The one thing I was going to ask is about the feasts that you're thinking of putting on. What's the message that you're trying to put across there? Or I was just interested to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because the feast came out of a process that I used that was actually the source of a lot of interest on the part of social scientists, which came out of another project I did many years ago called the XPO, where I reopened a former post office, rural post office, as a social and cultural space. But and that came out of the conflict in Mullaghmore and the lack of spaces where people who didn't necessarily agree with one another could begin to communicate with one another. And I'm not sure how aware you are or not, but the legacy of a conflict in Mullaghmore, which is in the Burren, has cast a very long shadow on social relations in the area. And Expo, you can read all about it. It was actually my PhD project, and my thesis is online if anybody wants to see it, but there's also papers I've written about it. But one of the processes that came out of an Expo was a process I called Mind Nehel, which was a kind of knowledge sharing space. So we'd have gatherings at Expo where anybody who had a question. So, for example, one farmer wanted to know, how could he get an anaerobic digester for his farm to deal with farm waste? Now, I didn't have answers for that, but I was able to circulate that to people I knew in Chagask, who then circulated it amongst their network. And then eventually, about 3 months later, an answer came back, which was a really useful report on small-scale anaerobic digesters. I then used the process in various other projects, sometimes very successfully and sometimes very unsuccessfully. And the fee structure is a way of kind of finding a structure that will allow people to overcome there are natural inhibitions to speak to people that they wouldn't normally speak to in their daily lives. And the meal is, of course, one of the spaces where you can do that. But these meals will actually be quite tightly structured. So, for example, there'll be an equivalent of a banner tea to keep the conversation moving. The whole meal will be recorded on audio. And the outcome of all the transcripts from all three meals will become the basis, with permissions from all participants, will become the basis for the script for a film that will be then made afterwards. So, and the reason I'm doing that is because it displaces it from the formal report, and it pulls out the kind of intersubjective communications and conversations and perhaps tensions and disagreements that emerge over the course of the meal, but it puts them into a safer space. Do you understand what I mean?
I do, yeah.
So because I think this is the problem with participative methodologies. All too often people go into them and they simply, and I include myself here, I repeat my standard guff. And I think we need to do more than that. I think now there is an urgency about finding ways to facilitate communication that go beyond our kind of subjective, tightly held positions. And sometimes the experience of eating food can do that. The actual dinner service themselves, they're really beautiful. They're slightly clunky because I'm not a ceramicist. So they're a bit awkward and a little bit gawky, the plates, they're a bit wonky. But the imagery, and this is where the ideal plant comes in, that gives people a point of communication. So what might your ideal plant be? So that's actually seen as a conversation starter. But then the actual physical experience of holding these potato mugs and I spent 10 years working on a project called Spud, because the potatoes spoke so deeply to subjectivities about what knowledge counts, feeling other, national identity, that rarely find a space in public. So, yeah, the actual cast porcelain potato cups are really interesting when they find their way into people's hands. So I don't know whether that has answered your question.
Yeah, no, it has. Yeah. I just really liked the term feasts, as opposed to like it kind of reclaiming conviviality and social ecological relations, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But they're very tightly 24 people, no alcohol. They'll be very tightly structured. Yeah.
So there's a hand up from Brenda McNally. Brenda, do you want to?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Deirdre.
Hi, Brenda.
Yeah, a really, really interesting presentation. And I really loved what you were just mentioning there about how the meal, sort of destabilizes the traditional kind of focus group participatory approach. And I was just wondering if you could, talk a little bit about how challenging is it to find people to participate in your projects, particularly maybe amongst the farming community who could be resistant, let's say, in the context of sustainability and so on, but not necessarily so. And are there any particular farming groups that you haven't yet reached? I mean, do you get a broad reach, or have you found it's a particular type of farmer or something like that?
Great question. It's by word of mouth, and it's in face-to-face encounter. So the various kind of, I have gradually over the years met a lot of people, some of them farmers, some of them food producers. So I go by personal references. So I'll ask people, do you know any farmers who might be interested in this? and then I follow up with the phone, and then I'll do a visit. So it's very slow, and it takes time to build up trust. You know, and in a way, I think I have an advantage because I'm not a social scientist. I'm only an artist. And actually, that's, you know, I was talking to Taz about this earlier. It's a really interesting space to hold. Now, artists have been really guilty of producing very reductive and essentialized ideas of farming and landscape and land. But I think within contemporary art practice, and in Ireland in particular, there's a really rich, diverse number of people, many of them women, artists also like Paul, Mark Clare, for example, who are actively engaged in this kind of work and how to best engage different publics, whether they're farmers or whether they're, you know, diverse groups. But for me, it's really slow, that process of getting to meet people, and it involves a lot of travel and knocking on doors, and actually the biggest way, these days, my best entry point is to show what I've been doing. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's great. It really does help, because it's difficult if you don't have an in and that to the community, whatever the community be, and the idea of trust. And I think also you're very correct. That point of coming in as an artist is already changing the balance of powers and expectations and maybe biases or whatever. Thank you, Deirdre. That's really.
I think I should also say that I'm really clear about representation when I talk to people. So how the work will be used, how public conversations might be. So there is a kind of, I've learned the hard way that I need to be ethically rigorous about what I do. Yeah.
Sophia, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
I'm muting. Hi. Hello, Deirdre.
Hi, Sophia. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much for your lovely presentation. Now, I actually got it's not really a mean question, but as a gardener, I know there's no such thing as an ideal plant. And as a gardener, I'm used to failure and repetition. So all your work, I know, has always been beautiful and perfect. You can't really talk about potatoes without thinking about crop failure. So when you think about sainfoin and trefoil potatoes, your cross, a big scale scheme, what happens if it goes wrong?
Totally, I'm dealing with this right now. The model plot in Tipperary, I planted with sainfoin at the end of August, and none of it's taken. And originally the idea was that was just to be sainfoin. And so we had a meeting last week because that was the very question that was on the table. And it's really important for that project that as a model plot, it work. So we had to talk through strategies. What's the plan B? Well, the plan B is now that we're going to plant 4 different crops. The plan C is that I will have plugs of plants growing in polytunnels. So I know it's a disaster time-wise, but should crops fail, at least there are some, the planting itself will maintain an integrity. But of course, I actually wanted to leave the sainfoin as it was. And if it failed, let that become visible. But actually, I totally took on board the point that if the idea is to get farmers engaged in shifting potential animal fodders that are grown, then we need to show examples of what can work as well. So hopefully with 4 crops, at least one of them will take successfully. And I'm really grateful to Tommy Boland and Helen Sheridan, and I'd be drawing on any advice that any of you can offer to make it as successful as possible. So please, Sophia, come down.
Thank you for your answer.
That's great. Thanks very much. So I think we're out of time. That's been a wonderful presentation and a fascinating discussion. So thanks very much again, Deirdre, for joining us. And thanks again to Emer O'Boyle and UCD Parity Studios for running this great program, and also to Dunleary Rathdown Council for partnering with us in this particular case. So I really do look forward to working with you over the coming year, Deirdre, and to seeing how things shape up.
Great.
So thanks very much indeed.